Good morning and welcome to day one of the 2022 Academic Symposium. We are in our 5th year of celebrating student and mentor research at Quincy University. Before we begin today's presentations, I would like to thank all of the students and mentors for participating in this week's events. It's a lot of hard work and we're so excited to celebrate with you. We'd also like to thank the QU Office of Community Relations and Instructor Jim Lawrence for their expertise in promoting and recording the event. Lastly, to Chartwells and Dan Kemner for our snacks and setup. A little housekeeping, if you would take just a moment to silence your phones. Additionally, each presenter will share his or her research for 10 to 20 minutes. They will then invite you to ask questions, and we will be passing a microphone around for that time. Once finished, you're welcome to use the restroom to get a snack, and then we will try to stay on schedule for today. So let's get started. Our first presenter is Chelsea Hooker, who will present the relationship between our sense of sight and taste. Chelsea's mentor is Dr. Kristina Mouzakis. Chelsea, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi. So today I will be presenting on the relation between our sense of sight and taste. So a little background on why I decided to do this research. So we see this in popular media such as Hell's Kitchen, which is a cooking competition hosted by Gordon Ramsay. In this competition, there's a specific competition that is called the blind taste test, where chefs are blindfolded and asked to taste 4 different types of food that they use in their everyday cooking. And this interested me because they obviously use this every day, they taste it every day, and it's in their everyday food. But more often than not, they get almost every single one wrong. So this brought it up to me, and then I was also interested in just exploring the senses as a whole. So with these 2 combinations, I decided to conduct this research. So before we begin, I have to kind of explain a little bit between how sight and taste actually work. And to do this, we have to look at biology. So when we're looking at the connection between sight and taste, it's actually mostly sensory science. So we have to look at 4 different things. We have to look at the olfactory sensation, the gustatory sensation, texture, and flavor. So the olfactory sensation is basically our sense of smell. And the olfactory cells are located in the olfactory epithelium at the top of the nasal cavity. So right around this area, or if you look on the diagram, right around here. So basically, in order for our olfactory sensation to work, every sense has to be in a gas form. If it's not in a gas form, our sense won't pick it up. Then we have to look at the gustatory sensation. This is our sense of taste. Stimulation of the chemoreceptors in the taste buds on the tongue, soft palate of the throat, and the majority of everything else on the tongue. So that deals with mostly your taste buds, saliva, stuff like that, and obviously it is located in your mouth. So for this to work, saliva is a very important thing as it works as a solvent. Kind of a little bit of chemistry in here. It breaks things down, and in doing this, chewing actually is an important part of this as well. When you chew, it activates the stimuli of thought, the stimuli of smell, sight, and all these combinations basically make you anticipate the food that's coming in. Have you ever heard this the saying, makes your mouth water? Well, that's that whole sensation right there. So then we also have to look at texture and flavor. Texture is basically also a feeling that you can have in your mouth, which is also picked up by the taste buds. It can be oily, it can be smooth, it can be crunchy, rough. You think of a texture that you can feel with your fingers, your tongue also picks up those same textures. And flavor is basically all 3 of those things working together at once, as your olfactory, your gustatory, and your textures all working together to combine and make a flavor. So then we also had to look at age. Why are we looking at age? Well, because as you get older, the less sensitive your taste buds get. So if you ever hear an elderly person saying, oh, this isn't, seasoned enough, it's not salty enough, well, that's because their taste buds are literally desensitized to taste. So as you get older, your taste buds degrade. And then we also have to look at disease. So harmful diseases such as cancer or any other disease that has like a severe impact on your body has also an impact on your sense of taste. Also, when you have chemotherapy for cancer, this degrades your taste buds, which causes things to taste less and less. So if you have a disease, you basically develop the taste buds of an elderly person. So we also have to look at how the brain works and why this is important as well. So there are 3 different parts that we have to look at. We have to look at the primary cortex, the orbital frontal cortex, and the pregeneral cingulate cortex. So to begin with the primary taste cortex, this is located near the somatosensory cortex, or the parietal lobe, which is located right over here. And this represents taste and texture. And then these involve neurons that involve salt, sweet, sour, and bitter, so your 4 basic components of taste. Other neurons encode oral somatosensory stimuli, including viscosity, which is thick and sticky, fat texture, temperature, and capsaicin, which is a component of chili peppers. You've heard of capsicum, which is bell peppers. Capsaicin is your more chili peppers. Then we have to look at the orbital frontal cortex. This is located near the prefrontal cortex, or this purple part of the brain. This is the pleasantness and reward system where food is represented. And this is also called your secondary taste cortex. So you have your primary and your secondary. And this cortex is actually more selective in how taste is represented. It also provides a basis of change in appetite for some foods, not all foods though. So say you're eating like a steak dinner, and all of a sudden this cortex fires and you start craving chocolate. That's what this does, because your brain selectively wants something else at this point. So then we have to look at the pregeneral cingulate cortex. This is a midline structure located more towards the middle of the brain. And this deals with wavelengths of light, photon detection, so this is basically your sight. And scents are also detected in this part of the brain. And for taste alone in this part of the brain, there are 50 different receptors that detect sugar, acids, and bitter tastes. And then there's also 3 receptors for vision, which we discussed. It also comes into play with the cingulate cortex. Those 2 kind of work hand in hand together. So when I was compiling this research, I had to think of 2 different research questions. So my first research question was, does a person's ability to see their food impact their ability to identify the food? And the hypothesis I came up with this was taking away a person's ability to see their food will hinder their ability to identify the food quickly and correctly. Those 2 were very important parts for the research. And then the second question that I came up with, which will also be discussed further on down the road, was does age have an effect on a person's taste buds depending on if the food is hot or cold? And then the hypothesis I came up with is as a person gets older, their taste buds tend to become duller and less sensitive to the temperature of the food. I only heavily looked at the first research question, and I will explain why the second research question wasn't heavily looked upon. So my participants for this study were 21 current QU students, all from different classes, including 5 freshmen, 5 sophomores, 6 juniors, and 5 seniors. There was a little bit of variety in males versus females. There were 3 males, 18 females, but it was predominantly a female-composed study. And then also a different range of ages. So I had 4 18-year-olds, 1 19-year-old, 6 20-year-olds, 6 21-year-olds, 3 22-year-olds, and 1 23-year-old. And how I got these participants was through the Quincy University softball team, as well as mutual friends, including roommates and friends of their friends. So when I was conducting the study, I made a few observations. So a lot of them were actually really nervous. Like, my teammates were especially nervous when I was giving them to me because they know me for 3 years, as long as I've been here. But they were still nervous about it. And a couple of them were extremely happy that they were just getting free foods. One of my teammates even quoted, she was happy to get free Oreos out of this. So, but why were they nervous? The ones that really didn't know me, some thought that I wasn't a trustworthy person. They didn't know like what I was going to do to them, what was going to happen if I blindfolded them. They thought I was going to deceive them. A lot of them thought I was going to give them nasty or weird foods, you know, like molded cheese or something like that. A lot of them were really freaked out that I wasn't going to give them basic snack foods, which I heavily implied when they signed up for the study. And that was also why a lot of them didn't participate as well. It was just because of the nerves of being blindfolded and have to put their trust in another person to give them food really freaked them out, and it really hindered a lot of participants because they just could not get over that hurdle of she is trustworthy, she's going to give you, normal food. So then my materials for this study, for my control, I had 4 different snack foods. I did goldfish, Oreos, as mentioned earlier, a popular hit, by the way, oranges, and peanuts. And then my test foods were American cheese, chocolate chips, basic apples, and popcorn. And I also had writing utensils, sheets that recorded the answers of each participant, and blindfolds as well that were used for the blinded part of the study. So my procedures for this were pretty simple. I would sit out the participants, explain what was happening to them, and then I would hand them each food in a little cup to make sure sanitary purposes. So they would get their food, they would be able to see it with the control person of it. They would taste it, they would get it all eaten, they would write down their answer, and we would repeat that for the 4 different foods. And then after that, I had them blindfolded. I instructed them to put their blindfold on, explained that once they tasted their food, they were allowed to take off their blindfold, write the answer, and put their blindfold immediately back on. I also asked them in this portion of the study to make sure that they didn't look around the table, to make sure their portions were completely empty so they couldn't see anything. I did everything I could to make sure that they didn't see any other foods for the test portion of this. And I repeated this 4 different times for the test and for the control. So then my results. I ended up having to reject my hypothesis since my T-critical and my T-obtained were equal. So typically with hypotheses, if your T-critical is less than your T-obtained, you reject the null hypothesis. And in this study, it was equal. So our P was also equal to our alpha, which is typically 0.05 when you're conducting a T-test. So I only ran a T-test because no other test was available, and it was the only appropriate test to run in this. I tried to run a correlation, which I will explain in the next slide, and it came out pretty unsuccessful, and I'll show you with the data that will be presented. So then there could be a possible correlation with the data, with the critical and the obtained being equal to one another. It could have a correlation, but there would need to be more participants and maybe a different variety of foods to test this fully. So then, when I'm looking at this, this was the chart that I compiled for my study. So the pink ones were the controls, and the blues were the tests. Anything in orange that has a 1 in it stated that they got the answer correct. Anything with a 2 that is highlighted in green stated that they got the answer wrong. So when I was running these correlations, I ran into a lot of divide by 0 errors because you can't divide 1 by 1 and try to run a correlation with it. It just wasn't possible with the Excel program. And we even tried running it by hand a couple of times, and it still wouldn't work out properly. So then we also couldn't calculate Pearson's correlation, which was a big part of the study as well, since, again, trying to take all these numbers, a 1 and a 1 does not work out well. The only ones that truly worked out well were anything that was divided by the peanut section, the American cheese, and the chocolate chip section, just because they had a little bit different variance in their numbers and how the answers were perceived. And then what I also saw with this data was typically when you have blindfolded, simple things such as American cheese and chocolate chips were really hard to identify. People were either going way too specific or way out in left field with those 2 foods. One person even thought that the American cheese was some type of jelly, which was a very interesting answer to get. So what I did with this data was I actually ended up putting it in success percentages. So if they got everything right, it ended up being 100. And then if they got things wrong, obviously the percentages changed. And then I took all those percentages and averaged it out, which came to about 14%. There was one outlier because this person missed the control with peanuts. They just couldn't identify the peanut. And then I took those and I found the standard deviation, which was 0.187 if you round it up to the nearest hundredth. So then this was the ultimate test that I ran, the t-test that we have presented. And this was for the percentages. So I took the percentages, average, everything like that, and then I ran it into a test. And it has to be a two-tailed, so we look at the two-tailed T-critical of it. Because unless told otherwise, it is always a two-tailed test. And for me, this had to be a two-tailed test as well. So when you're looking at the T-critical for the two-tailed, the answer was 2.086, again, rounding to the nearest hundredth. But we also took a few different numbers. We took Cohen's D, which was 0.766, the confidence level, both upper and lower, which were 14.388 and 14.212. And that's typically like where a number should fall, should it be into the confidence level. So we had a really small confidence level in this experiment as well. And then we also found the R, which correlates into a t-test, which was 4.583. So overall, when I was conducting this experiment, I found that it was not what the literature found. A lot of the literature said there is a connection between sight and taste. You know, if you take the sight away, your taste is going to be different. But based on my study and based on the results, there wasn't really a connection between those two. And as stated before, there would need to be a more diverse population, a larger population, and even more, a little bit of different food to get the studies that I would need in order to find if the literature is truly what it says it is. And then when I was conducting this research, I unfortunately had a lot of limitations, specifically because my experiment fell right in the middle of Lent season. And as we all know, Lent season is typically where people give things up for that period of time. And a lot of them, also on Fridays when I could really only conduct the test, can't eat meat on the Lent season. So I initially had 2 different types of proteins ready to go, and unfortunately I had to nix those and find different types of foods last minute because I forgot that it was Lent season. So on top of that, I also had to get types of foods in general, so I had to find foods that were very easily identifiable, foods that were prepackaged based on the pandemic still, so I couldn't really prepare anything as well. And then on top of that, I found that I had an age limitation. Because of time constraints and because of trying to get everything gathered for the symposium, there was a little bit of a time constraint which deterred me from finding participants that were a part of faculty and staff. So I couldn't fully test the age hypothesis as well. So then some further research that I was looking into, definitely expanding the thought of having seasoned food in my study, maybe mashed potatoes or, seasoned turkey, not during Lent, obviously, but doing stuff like that would make more of a basis to see if sight really does have a connection to taste, especially when it comes to foods that we have every day. Like I'm sure, if you have a steak dinner, you have mashed potatoes with it. That's something you would see every day. And then on top of that, I'm actually in another research methods class, and something that was brought up in that class was how does COVID-19 affect taste? Because as we know with research that has been found already, COVID-19 has the ability to basically take away a person's senses, more specifically smell and taste. What I wanted to explore was how could a person who has recovered fully from COVID-19 taste their food if they, had the disease. So some people say it takes months for their taste to come back and it's never the same. Some people say they never got it back. Some say they got it back within a week. So I would want to look at that and see if it is like the disease, like how does it affect certain portions of our brain? Is it affecting the tongue, stuff like that. And then my group member also brought up pregnancy. She explained that when she was pregnant, her hormones prevented her from having certain foods because she would either throw it up or she would just gag and couldn't even get it in her mouth. So what I wanted to look at was, how does this truly affect taste? Like, is it strictly hormones, or is it something that's on your tongue that also prevents this? Is it also a part of the brain, as we discussed earlier, like which portion of the brain, stuff like that, that would enable a pregnant woman to taste certain foods or not be able to taste certain foods? Like, if I gave her the same 4 foods from this research, would she be able to taste those foods, or would she immediately try to throw them up and not even be able to taste them at all? So that was some further research. I also wanted to look at different types of tongues. There's a thing called a geographical tongue where grooves are deeper in the tongue. Taste buds are a little more sensitive to things such as sour or overly sweet things or bitter things. So if I looked at that and maybe factor that into my next study, like saying, do you have a normal tongue? Do you have a geographical tongue? Or if they have like burn marks on their tongue from something, how is that going to affect how they taste their food as well? And then these were all the references that I used for my literature and throughout my study. And then thank you for listening. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, that was a lot of work on your part, it sounds like, trying to get everything organized. So I have a couple of questions if I have time. So you talked about this thing called Cohen's D, but you didn't really describe to us what it was. So what is Cohen's D, and what does that number mean in relation to your data?
Whoops, sorry about that.
As best as you can.
I looked at the definition, unfortunately, and I slipped my mind. So Cohen's D is basically something that is run with t-tests and stuff like that. And when we put t-test in there, it's another factor that comes out of it. So you use either your t-critical or t-obtained, and it's a number that you would find in order to find another type of relation in it.
Okay, and so you got a .766 or something like that?
Yes, 0.766.
So what does that tell us about your results?
So typically with a Cohen's d, the closer it is to 1, the better the relationship is. So as I've stated, there could be a relationship based on Cohen's d as well. And with the .766, there is a relation. It is more of a positive relationship based on my hypothesis as well that there is a connection, but as stated previously, there would need to be more research to find maybe a better Cohen's d as well.
Thank you.
When I was in graduate school, I was helping somebody do some research, and we were using a technique called factor analysis, and she would typically ask me, "Tell me again what factor analysis means." So don't feel too embarrassed about not knowing what this D means. I'm not familiar with it either.
So this is something that you didn't do, but I wanted to ask you what you found in your literature review, or what you think based on the research that you've done, or if you have an opinion on it. So would you expect to see any differences between men and women in these effects?
So in my literature review, there was one article that had discussed the difference between men and women, particularly with the type of sweetness of the food, so more in relation with like candies or chocolates or something that has more of a sweet taste to it. And they did find that men have a more susceptible taste to sweetness, but overall women generally have what is called the sweet tooth. So that could be something I would look into later on, and this also could be a factor in my study as well, making more of an even participant pool with equal men and equal women, and maybe even testing the sweetness of it. But there really wasn't any literature that stated that men have more superior taste to women or vice versa.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. That was wonderful. We'll take a short break and get back right at 10:30. Thank you.